It's one of the biggest questions out there, right? Why are some countries so incredibly wealthy while others just seem trapped in this endless cycle of struggle? It's a question that has puzzled people for a long, long time. Well, today we're going to dig into a theory that gives a pretty bold and, for some, a pretty controversial answer to that exact question.
I mean, you see it all the time. In one part of the world, you've got glittering skyscrapers, incredible tech, just massive wealth. And in another, you've got poverty, you've got instability, people just fighting for the basics. Now, the standard story we often hear is, oh, it's just a matter of time. Some countries just need to catch up. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the system itself is actually designed to keep things exactly as they are?
And that question right there is the absolute heart of what's called dependency theory. See, this whole framework really started taking shape back in the mid-1900s. People were looking around and noticing something strange. Formal colonialism was ending, countries were gaining independence, but that huge economic gap between the rich and poor nations, it wasn't shrinking. In fact, a lot of the time, it was getting even bigger. So let's unpack exactly how this theory tries to explain why.
Okay, so the first big idea of dependency theory is simple, but it's also kind of radical. It says, hey, stop thinking about developed and developing countries as if they're just on different rungs of the same ladder, or in separate lanes on a highway. Instead, the theory wants you to picture one single, giant, interconnected global system. And this system is split into two main parts, the core and the periphery.
So the idea here is that the prosperity of the core, the wealthy industrialized nations, it doesn't just happen on its own. The theory argues that it's directly tied to, and in fact, it depends on the resources and the cheap labor coming from the periphery, those nations in the global south. It's not about two different economies running side by side. Nope. It's one big system, and it's built on a relationship that is fundamentally unequal.
And when you break it down, it looks something like this. The core countries, they control the high-profit stuff, finance, technology, all the patents. The periphery, well, they provide the basic building blocks, the cheap labor and the raw materials. But here's where the theory goes a step further. It suggests this economic setup actually creates different types of governments. In the core, you tend to see welfare states that take care of a high-skilled workforce. But in the periphery, you're more likely to see authoritarian states. And the theory argues their main job becomes controlling their own people to make sure that cheap labor and all those resources keep flowing out to the core.
All right, so if that's the basic structure, the big question is, how does it keep going? I mean, what are the gears that keep this whole dependency machine running, year after year, generation after generation? Well, the theory points to a few really key pieces of the puzzle.
And this is super important. According to the theory, the system isn't just forced on these countries from the outside. It actually relies on things inside the peripheral nations to keep it all working. Let's really zero in on what the theory says is maybe the most crucial part of this whole setup.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. The theory talks about something called the state-capitalist nexus. Fancy term, but the idea is pretty simple. In the periphery, political power and money get all tangled up. You get this local state class, a group of elites, and their own personal wealth stops being about building up their own country's economy. Instead, it becomes tied to managing their country's labor and resources for big global companies. They basically become the on-the-ground managers for this whole system of dependence. And this creates this really powerful self-feeding loop. Think about it. First, global capital comes looking for cheap labor and resources. Then that local state class we just talked about, they open the doors, they make it easy, and they get a nice cut of the profits for themselves. Now, to protect this whole deal, the workforce has to be controlled, right? So wages are kept low, and if people protest, that dissent is often suppressed. All of this allows that value, the wealth from the labor and resources, to be pulled out and sent back to the core. And what does that do? It just makes the whole system stronger, and the cycle starts all over again.
So we've talked about the big picture model, the mechanics of it all. But what does this actually feel like for the millions and millions of people who live in these peripheral nations every single day? Well, the theory argues there's a very real and very high human cost.
And we're not just talking about abstract economic concepts here. This stuff translates into real life. It means intense exploitation of workers. It means the workforce is often deliberately kept de-skilled because skilled labor costs more, right? Work becomes precarious, unstable, you never know if you'll have a job tomorrow. And you see this huge, massive gap grow between that tiny group of elites who are benefiting and, well, pretty much everyone else. The state itself, in this view, ends up focusing more on protecting foreign investments than on protecting the rights of its own people.
And it's not always just a simple core versus periphery, north versus south kind of thing. The theory is more nuanced than that. It also points out that this same dynamic can happen within the global south. You can have more powerful peripheral countries acting like a core to their smaller, less powerful neighbors. It creates this whole complex web of dependencies. Sometimes people call it the South of the South dynamic. All right, let's zoom out for a second and look at the big picture here. What's the main takeaway when you look at the world through the lens of dependency theory? Well, it really fundamentally challenges some of the most basic ideas we have about how the global economy is supposed to work. And this might be the theory's most powerful and most unsettling argument. It completely flips the idea of development on its head. From this point of view, when a peripheral nation develops, it isn't actually climbing the ladder to become like a core nation. No, it's often just getting better at its job in the system, becoming a more efficient source of cheap labor or raw materials. It's locking itself deeper into its subordinate role, not breaking free from it. And that's exactly why you so often hear dependency theory talked about in the same breath as neocolonialism. The argument is pretty straightforward. Yeah, the old colonial flags came down and countries got their independence. But the basic economic relationship, one of extraction and control, that whole dynamic never really went away. It just changed its tactics. Instead of direct rule by armies, it now works through things like international finance, debt, and the power of multinational corporations.
So, if you take away just one thing from all this, let it be this. According to dependency theory, the massive inequality we see across the globe, it's not a mistake, it's not a bug in the system, it's not a sign that the system is broken. It's a feature. It's the expected, predictable result of a system that is running exactly the way it was designed to.
Which leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. If the global economy is a game, is everyone actually playing on a level field? Or, as this theory suggests, was the game board tilted right from the start, set up in a way that ensures the house, the core, always wins? It's a really challenging way to see the world, and definitely something to chew on.